Today we are covering Blaise Pascal. Pascal is a 17th century Frenchman. So he lives after Descartes. A little bit on his background. He was actually primarily a mathematician. He's famous for his work on conic sections, so parabolas, hyperbolas, ellipses, circles, etc. Okay, Pascal is also famous for pioneering early calculating machines, calculators, which were predecessors to computers. Okay, and in fact, there's a computing language named after him as a result of that. In philosophy, his influence was substantial, although somewhat limited. So if you have been sitting in class all semester and you've thought to yourself, as we've covered one thinker who says this and another thinker who says that, if you've thought to yourself, well, these guys disagree with each other and they arrive at opposite conclusions, so what am I supposed to do? Pascal is the thinker for you. Okay? If your experience has been, well, there are good arguments for God's existence, there are arguments against God's existence, I'm just going to throw up my hands and, say, well, the reasoning here, the method must be bankrupt if you can arrive at contradictions through the use of reason. And Pascal is precisely the philosopher of non-reason. Okay, he holds to a position known as fideism. Fideism is a philosophical school that is opposed to rationality as a source of philosophical insights. Okay, so fideism is the view that reason can lead to contradictions. Therefore, reason is bankrupt as a method of inquiry. Okay, Pascal had a very illustrious but short professional career. He died in his 30s of tuberculosis. They called it consumption back then. And unfortunately for this reason, the pensées, or thoughts, which we read in this class, which I hope you were able to read in preparation for today's session, is a fragmented work. Okay, the Pensées is not a completed work. It just contains a series of vignettes or short thoughts which haven't been put together into some sort of a systematic whole. Okay, so whereas Descartes approached philosophy by carefully constructing a well-reasoned system that includes lots of inspections of objections and encounters with alternative views and explanations for why he rejects these alternative views, the Pensées, Pascal's Pensées, is written instead just as a series of social observations without any thorough inspection of alternative points of view or any thorough build-out of the philosophy. Okay, and this is partly because he died before finishing it, but partly actually also probably because he is opposed to the building of systems. He is an anti-systemic philosopher. He thinks that the construction of systems is precisely where reason goes wrong. And that's his fideism coming out. Okay, Pascal notoriously was also a very melancholy individual. The stories about his depression are extensive. He once equated human life to the following scenario. He said that basically being a human is sitting in a room, and in this room there are benches along the four walls of the room. There are no windows, just a door. And all of humanity is seated along the benches on the four walls. And every once in a while, a man in a big black executioner's hat comes through the door with his axe and grabs one of us and hauls that person through the door. And the rest of us just sit there and we wait. We wait our turn knowing that the executioner will come for us at some point, and that will be the end. But we don't know what's on the other side of the door. We just know that it's going to happen. Okay, and this is like a very melancholy kind of a depiction of what life is as a human being, but it's quintessential Pascal. Okay, he had a sister, Jackie. Jackie is a well-known thinker in her own right. And many of the insights of the Pensées can be credited to Jackie. Unfortunately, of course, she lived at a time when women didn't publish, and so we think that many of her insights, she was a very well-educated woman, can be found in the Pensées, in some of the thoughts that Pascal has written down there. Let me see if there's anything else in terms of his background that would be pertinent and interesting to share. He developed the world's first subway system. He was responsible for drawing up a system for tunnels, and developed that system beneath Paris. Kendrick. Oh, yeah, I just mean systems philosophically, so rational systems, yeah. By a subway system, all I mean is just a series of tunnels for transporting people in trains underground. Mm-hmm. All right. Let me talk a little bit about Pascal's main contribution. At least, he made a variety of contributions, but the main one we'll focus on in this class. Okay, Pascal said, there's really, if you look at humanity, humans are really small and insignificant, especially in comparison to the other physical objects we find in our world. If you look at the mountains, they were there before we were here, they will be there after we are here. The forests, the rivers, the valleys, if you look at the starry heavens above us, the planets, the sun, the stars, the galaxies, they are all enormous in comparison to us, and they all long predate us and will long succeed us. We are mere blips on the timeline of history, and so insignificant. But in another sense, Pascal said we are incredibly significant. In fact, in another secondary sense, we are more significant than any of these things. More significant than the mountains, more significant than the trees, the rivers, the valleys, because we know that they are there, and they do not know that they are there. Because we have consciousness, because we have the ability to classify, to identify, to think, and to recognize our own selves as things with consciousness and therefore with meaning. And Pascal said, for all creatures who have the ability to think like we do, there arises a certain dilemma in life. Okay, and so I'm going to move on to the contribution we'll focus on in this class, and that is the Pascal wager. Pascal is famous in part for his contributions to probability theory, and in the field of philosophy, he developed an argument, if you would call it that, since he's kind of the anti-argument philosopher, an argument for God's existence based on probability theory. Okay, and he said, look, everyone faces a choice. All humans face a choice. All creatures of conscious reflection and goodwill face a choice. And that choice is, what do we do with the question, does God exist? Does God exist? Because if God does exist, it clearly makes an enormous difference in our lives and in how we ought to lead our lives. And if he does not exist, that clearly makes an enormous difference as well. And Pascal said, look, there are arguments to be made for God's existence, the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. We looked at those three, but there are others as well. The moral argument is an argument we haven't looked at, or the evolutionary argument from naturalism. There are other arguments for God's existence. Pascal said, at the end of the day, really there are just two potential answers to the question, does God exist? You can say yes, or you can say no. And all human beings have to answer the question. You can't get out of the question. not as though you can defer the question. Some people might call themselves agnostics. Some people might call themselves agnostics, meaning they don't want to make a choice about God's existence. They don't think that there's enough evidence for one view or for the other. But Pascal said, for those who are agnostics, their I don't know becomes a no upon their deathbed. Okay, by default. So you either have to say yes or you have to say no. There's no other way around it. Okay. Okay, we'll call this the yes axis. And we'll call this the no axis. And Pascal said there are 4 options. Actually, I'm sorry for totally messing your notes up. I'm going to set it up this way. I'm going to set it up yes and no like that. And then the outcome could be yes or it could be no. Okay, so sorry for messing your notes up. So you can answer the question, does God exist? Yes. You can answer the question, does God exist? No. And then the potential outcome when you die could be yes or no. Okay, so let's look at no first. Actually, let's start with this first quadrant. Yes and yes. If you answer yes and it turns out you are correct when you die, you wake up on the other side, what do you get? Eternal life, right? On the Christian worldview, you get, bliss forever. Magical, wonderful, beautiful bliss. We'll call it plus infinity, since Pascal likes to put this in mathematical terms. Do you lose anything if you guess yes, and yes is the actual outcome? No. Okay, you do lose a little bit, Pascal thought. You actually lose whatever other things you could have done in life if you had lived your life as if no were the case. Okay, but in comparison to the plus infinity, it's insignificant. So we'll say minus 10. Okay? And I mean things like, Pascal was envisioning things like, right, if God doesn't exist, then you could exploit little old ladies in your business affairs all you wanted. Okay, or if God doesn't exist, you could sleep around all you wanted. Or cheat on your taxes or whatever, right? So every sin is sweet for a season, for a short period of time at least, and you would miss out on the pleasures of that sin if you live your life as if God exists and in fact he does exist. But you'd also get plus infinity. Okay. We'll just say minus 100 actually. All right, suppose you say yes and no is the outcome. What do you lose?
Doesn't exist.
Right. So it doesn't exist. So you don't get plus infinity. Probably, Pascal said, you never know because you just stop being. Okay, that's what he said is probably the outcome if this is the case. So you lose out on the fun things you could have done in life. Do you gain anything? Well, it could be argued that virtue is its own reward. Okay, it could be argued that living a life of healthy fidelity, virtue, care for the poor, and so forth has merit. But we'll say for the sake of this illustration that it's less valuable than all the sin you could have done if you hadn't lived your life with a yes answer. Okay, all right. If you guess no, and no is in fact the outcome, you win, right? You win the wager. What do you get? All the things you could do if God doesn't exist. And in fact, you lived your life as if God doesn't exist. So you get plus 100, we'll say. Okay, and what do you lose? Well, the value of the virtuous life. Again, we'll assign it a value less than the value of the vicious life. Although I would actually make the case alongside Aristotle that virtue is its own reward. And I think I'm actually happier being a monogamously married man with children than I would be if I were living a life of a swinger. Okay? What if you guess no and yes is the outcome?
No everlasting life, but you had the sinful pleasures, so plus 100 minus infinity.
Plus 100 and minus infinity is absolutely right, Kendrick, right? So it's like, you're hosed. It's like, no! Okay, so Pascal says, look, this is the wager. Everybody faces this wager. You can't get out of it. What should you wager? So look at the mathematics of it. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? What should you wager?
No, yes.
Should wager yes. Okay, the mathematics is pretty obvious, he thinks. You should wager yes, because the upside is infinite, the potential upside is infinite, and if you wager no, the potential downside is infinite, while the upside is merely finite. Okay, so these numbers at the end of the day are kind of arbitrary. They don't really matter in comparison to these two numbers here, which are the guiding numbers throughout the matrix. You should clearly wager yes, he thinks. Okay, and he thought that this was an argument for God's existence. It's not structured like a cosmological argument or a teleological argument or something. In other words, it doesn't appeal to our reason. He was trying to find a way to make an argument that wasn't rational, as it were. It doesn't appeal to our reason, but it does appeal to our sense of probability and self-interest. And he thinks that it does make sense to think that God exists at the end of the day. Okay, let me stop, and I'm going to poke some holes in it. There are some objections that can be leveled against this. I want to stop, though, and ask if there are any questions or reflections so far on the Pascal wager. Does everybody kind of understand it? It's pretty straightforward. Kendrick?
But let's say this is our basis for believing in God, for example.
Sure.
Would God be disappointed in us if we go to heaven and so why did you believe me? And we pointed at that.
That's a great comment, man. So that's actually, we'll make that our first objection. I was going to level 3 objections against it. Okay, and the first objection is the wager is cynical. So at the end of the day, the reason why you're believing that God exists is because you can get the most. Okay? It's like, I want to get as much as possible. It's like a naked appeal to self-interest, isn't it, right? So, the objection could be made that actually, especially if you're in the Christian tradition as I am, and as Pascal himself is, Pascal's a Catholic, the objection could be made that you should follow God, but not just for self-interested reasons. Rather, you should follow God and obey God because doing so is to God's glory, and that's our purpose. That's what we have been created for, is to honor and glorify God. And honoring and glorifying God just for the sake of what we can get is kind of a cynical reason to obey. So goes the objection. Now, this objection, notice, does not refute the wager. The objection merely states something like, the wager is, it incentivizes or promotes the wrong kinds of character states in the people who take it. Notice it doesn't prove the wager to be wrong. It does, though, point out that the wager seems to be incentivizing self-interest, which is quite obviously, at least in the Christian tradition, not something that's supposed to be prioritized. Okay, so the wager is cynical is going to be our first objection. That's a good objection. Other objections, actually. Let me let you guys lead this. Other objections. Can you guys think of other objections to the wager? Think hard about it for a minute. There's a big one that we're actually dancing around and haven't arrived at yet. The wager doesn't prove the Christian God. Right? This is a big objection. The wager doesn't prove that you should follow the Christian God. You could run the wager for anything. You could run it for Islam. I mean, heck, you could run it for the Greek gods. And you say, I'm going to live my life believing that this was, suppose, you could run it for any one of a number of different religious perspectives, any one of a number of theistic perspectives. You could say, I'm going to live my life supposing Zeus is the supreme deity. And you could run the wager on that basis. Okay, so the wager does not actually show that answering the question, does God exist, with an affirmative means Christianity is correct. All it suggests is that some form of theism should be believed. Okay, so the wager does not appear to be a demonstration, again, of a monotheistic perspective or a monotheistic religion. It isn't a knockdown argument for a monotheistic metaphysics or explanation of the universe. But it does seem to be a refutation of atheism. Notice that there is basically no scenario, if Pascal has rendered this correctly, there's basically no scenario under which it makes sense to live one's life as an atheist. Okay, as long as there is a possibility that God might exist, be it ever so small, you shouldn't live your life as an atheist. But it does not prove that God is the Christian God, not the Islamic God or the Hindu gods or something like that. Or anything, yeah. I mean, you could live your life as if the Christian God is true, like I'm doing, and you die and wake up on the other side, and it's like, it was Zeus the whole time! Oh, what a mistake I made, right? It doesn't prove that the Christian God is the case. There's a third objection I want to look at, and that is that the wager is actually a dependent proof. The wager is a dependent proof for God's existence. Let me describe what I mean by that. The wager doesn't work if the existence of God, the probability of the existence of God is 0. The wager doesn't work if God's probability is 0. If the probability that God exists is 0, then it doesn't matter if you choose yes. We'll actually make this mathematical. Pascal really likes mathematics, right? So we'll say the yes vote and the yes life can be illustrated with a 1, and the no vote and the no life can also be illustrated with a 1. And we'll say that the mathematics governs the choice here. And we'll multiply your life by the potential reward. So 1 times infinity is infinity, right? And 1 times minus 100 is minus 100. And 1 times 50 is 50, and 1 times plus 100 is plus 100. But if God doesn't exist at all, then this vote of 1, which is represented by your life, could be equated to 0, since the possibility of God's existence is 0, right? And 0 times infinity is 0, right? 0 times infinity is 0. Just as 0 times these other numbers is also 0. So you have to have some sort of probability that God exists that is outside of the wager. It is a dependent argument. In other words, some other argument has to come first and has to prove that there is at least some probability that God exists, at least in our minds, sufficient to satisfy us. There's at least some probability that God exists. Notice that even if that probability is really small, even if the probability of God's existence is like 1%, okay, 1% in a decimal system is 0.01. 0.01 times infinity is what? Is infinity. It's still infinity, yeah. So even if that probability is really small, like 1%, you should still take the wager. Okay, you should definitely still take the wager because the number here is still incredibly large in comparison to the merely finite numbers throughout the rest of the matrix, the quadrants of the matrix. Okay, so other arguments have to prove that God exists, or I'm sorry, that there is a probability that God exists, however small, that is greater than 0. Arguments like the cosmological argument, or the teleological argument, or the ontological argument, or the moral argument, okay, or others as well. Okay, and if those arguments do establish that the possibility of God's existence is greater than 0, then the wager works. But it doesn't work if God's probability is 0. Okay, so here are 3 objections to the wager. What do we think of the wager? Reflections? Thoughts? Is it cynical? What do we think? Yeah, Kendrick.
I see the wager. It sort of works, but my issue is if this is your only basis for believing in God, I don't know. It doesn't really affect how you're going to live your life, because you can still believe in God with this wager, but it doesn't tell you to live a certain way or to live a right way. With this wager, it's just saying, oh, if you believe in God, you'll get these rewards, but it doesn't say anything about your conduct.
Good. Yeah, and so I guess Pascal, he's operating in the 17th century where it's kind of well known what. So Christianity is, of course, the dominant worldview in his culture, and it's kind of well known what the possible outcomes are on Christian teaching about the afterlife. So he's assuming that you get a lot, if that's the case. But again, as I mentioned, you could run the wager for any religious perspective, and it would succeed as a proof of that religious perspective. Guys, here's my take on it. I think that this is a refutation of atheism. I think it's like a knockdown refutation of atheism. There is no scenario on which living an atheist life, not believing in some sort of transcendental reality, makes any sense for humans. But I'm with Kendrick. I think beyond that, I'm not sure this accomplishes a whole lot. Maybe it's a good starting point, but if this is like the basis for your Christian faith, and you just stay there and like you're only in it for selfish reasons or something like that, yeah, you should probably like move on to greater spiritual maturity than just this. So I guess that would be my take on the wager. I don't know. Any thoughts or reflections on that? Okay. All right, but this is very famous, and Pascal leaned on it a lot as a way of finding passage around reason. I want to describe a second argument for God's existence, which I have not covered yet. This is an argument for God's existence on the basis of morality. We'll call it the argument from morality. And it's got 3 steps to it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and erase this.
Mr. Neil,
Yes.
I actually saw a meme very similar to that box you drew.
Oh, yeah.
Only in this case it was relating to studying. You don't study for the test, but you ace it somehow, or do you study for the test, but you don't ace?
That's funny. Let's list this in 3 steps. Step number 1, morality exists. Okay, that's premise number 1. Okay, premise number 2, God is the best I'm going to put here weak or only strong explanation of morality. Okay, therefore, conclusion, this is a really simple argument. God exists. Okay, let's go to the first premise first. Does morality exist? Certainly, almost all humans feel it to exist.
No, everyone acts on morality, but that doesn't disturb its existence. There will always be people who act out of good morality.
True, true. The great majority of human beings have acted as though it exists. Okay, some have argued that it is an illusion that humans have created for ourselves. Since obviously, like if you look out at nature outside of us, outside of human beings, you just look at the animal kingdom, they don't seem to have a moral sense. Okay, the lions eat the antelope. They don't stop and do group therapy sessions. They don't wonder among themselves, ought we really to be chasing down, hunting, and eating innocent antelope? After all, they haven't done anything wrong. But the lions don't do this. Dogs steal meat from each other. They don't stop and feel bad about having stolen meat from another dog. They don't go through periods of self-reflection and confession in response to having stolen meat from another dog. If you go outside of human beings, it doesn't seem to be around. Kendrick.
I was going to say, to make things even better, cats like to play with their victims or play with their...
Yeah, and there's sadism too, without any remorse. in the animal kingdom. Yeah, absolutely. Although, when I had a dog growing up, she seems to have some sort of primitive moral sense. So we would come home from being out as a family or something like that, and she would come up to us at the front door and like be slinking, and you'd know that she had knocked over something in the house somewhere. You just had to find it because she was like slinking around. Okay, so I don't know. Maybe that's a primitive moral sense. I'm not sure. Maybe it was just habituation or something. I'm not sure. I guess a more sophisticated animal psychologist could tell us. So some have objected then that this is just a fiction that we've made for ourselves. But it is so universal to the human experience. And like it's ubiquitous. Like basically all human beings subscribe to the existence of morality. You'd have to discard a whole bunch of things if you're going to object to premise number one. Okay, and if you think that morality doesn't exist, please come to me and I will strike you with my fist and steal all your money and see if you still believe that morality does not exist. Okay? So I think in practice, I guess I'd say everybody does behave as though it does, even if theoretically they might say it's a fiction. Now let's move on to the second premise, because this is like the one doing all the work. God is the best or only explanation of morality. Okay, there's a weak version of the premise and a strong version of the premise. Okay, a weak and a strong. I don't subscribe to the strong version of the premise. God is the only explanation of morality. Right, so suppose that God doesn't exist. And morality does. Where does this come from? What's our explanation here? What is this possible source of this? Supposing that morality is, it's got real existence, but God does not. What are non-theistic explanations for morality that could be the case? Oh, think about it, guys. Think about it for a minute. People of goodwill, okay. Instinct, okay. I like that. Yeah. There we go. Yes. Okay. That's the classic non-theistic explanation for where morality comes from. It is an evolutionary response to various environmental stimuli so as to maximize species propagation. Okay, an evolutionary response that maximizes species propagation. After all, think about it for a minute, guys. So suppose that we didn't have a sense that murder was wrong. Okay, a moral instinct or something like that murder was wrong. Suppose this wasn't a part of us. Well, I mean, anytime you or I wanted something, we'd probably just knock somebody off to take it, and the species wouldn't propagate itself, right? Species would die out. So we have this moral sense on the evolutionary explanation again of things. We have this moral sense so that we can preserve the human species, because that's an evolutionary response to our environmental stimuli. Okay, and other kinds of basic moral sensibilities, like sensibilities against theft or lying, are also of evolutionary value. It's good for the propagation of the species that we have this sensibility, therefore we have this sensibility, is the thinking here. Okay, what do we think of that? What do we think of the evolutionary explanation? Is it plausible? I don't see why not. Kendrick?
It doesn't explain why there's some people who aren't as moral, or why there are people who are without it completely.
Good, like psychopaths or something like that. People who don't seem to have no moral sense, or to have dulled their moral sense so much that they're unable to account for or to have the same kinds of ideas that the rest of us have. Good. Okay. Here's why, at the end of the day, don't buy the evolutionary explanation for morality. I think it's got a lot of problems with it. To be perfectly honest, I don't think it actually offers us the best explanation for species propagation. Okay, what's that?
No, I was also going to say that this would be only in relation to humans. It's not every animal exhibits that sense of morality either.
Absolutely, yes. That's correct. That's correct. But think about this counter argument against the evolutionary explanation of morality for a minute. Okay, so evolution selects for species propagation. It does not select for truth. Okay, it selects for species propagation, but not for truth. That means that if you had false beliefs that could advance species propagation, okay, so suppose you believed that tigers are magical demons who could kill you if you go close to them. But this actually advances species propagation because if you get too close to the tigers, they'll kill you and your species will not continue. Okay, but it's a false belief because you believe that tigers are magical demons that can kill you by virtue of their magical demonic powers. If you had that belief, it would actually be of value for species propagation but would not be true. In other words, evolution does not select for truth. Rather, it selects for your ability to propagate the species. Okay, so we would have, first of all, no guarantee that our morality is true. Okay, in other words, morality would be entirely functional or relative. And insofar as you believe morality to be true, I don't think you can source an evolutionary explanation of it. In other words, if you believe morality is, true, if you believe it to be true that you ought not to take innocent human life or something like that, and not merely of evolutionary advantage, then I don't think that you can reference an evolutionary argument for that truth, because the evolutionary process, the process of natural selection, does not select for truth. It selects for species propagation. Okay. Moreover, another problem with the evolutionary argument is that it doesn't necessarily select for. Well, let me spin it another way. Put it a different way. If it selects for species propagation and not for truth, then presumably the beliefs that we have as a result of evolution are beliefs that are of maximal species propagation capacity, but not beliefs that are of maximal truth. But they maximize species propagation. Okay, and if that's the case, then we could have all sorts of beliefs that are false about the nature of the world around us or about the existence of morality, and yet they could still be our beliefs by virtue of their ability to maximize species propagation. So I guess if you are a hard-bitten relativist and you think that morality is all just a fiction that we've made for ourselves, or that evolution has made for us, and there's no element of truth to it, it is not true that you shouldn't kill another person. It is just a convenient fiction that you shouldn't kill someone. If that is your belief, then I think you could buy an evolutionary explanation. But insofar as you think that morality has an element of truth to it, then I don't think you can buy an evolutionary explanation for it. At least I don't see how you can make that work. Okay, at any rate, I don't buy the strong version of this argument because I don't think that God is the only explanation of morality. I do, however, buy the weak version of it, which is that God is the best explanation of morality. In other words, the existence of some sort of theistic framework for the world, I think, is the best explanation for how we have the moral sensibilities that we have. It certainly best explains our moral sensibilities insofar as we believe these sensibilities to be true. Okay, because it grounds their truth. In other words, they are true because God has made them true. Okay, and it does a much better job of grounding truth than the evolutionary explanation does. So that is the argument, and obviously, if these are the case, then that's the case as well. And this is an example of the sort of an argument that is necessary in order to make the Pascal wager run. You have to have a supporting argument. And it's an argument that Pascal knew well and that he endorsed also alongside the wager. Are there any comments or questions about that? Reflections on it? Well, let me ask you guys, do you find it convincing or not? What do you think? Is this a convincing argument for God's existence, the argument for morality?
I find it convincing.
Okay.
Especially since in our faith we're taught that we are made in His image to an extent.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see it connects our morality to some degrees also a reflection of Him and how He's so moral and so good.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But let's say I wasn't a Christian. It would also kind of make sense too, because I'd observe, if I wasn't a psychopath, I'd have some moral characteristics as well,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd exhibit that.
Yeah. Yeah, notice that this kind of an argument assumes as a background assumption something like moral realism. And by moral realism, I just mean that, like I said before, a minute ago, that there is truth in moral principle, and it's not just fiction that we've made up for ourselves. If you believe that there is truth in morality, in other words, if you believe that it is true that you ought not to steal, or it is true that you ought not to lie, then I think the argument has powerful purchase. But if you don't believe that, then I don't see how the argument can work, because then you think that we have prohibitions against lying just for the sake of fictional convenience or something like that, in which case, quite obviously, the argument doesn't work. Okay, so notice that it has as a background assumption the moral realism assumption. Okay? All right, so that's most of what I wanted to accomplish today. We will have a test coming up on Friday. It's going to cover Descartes and also Pascal.